they see and what they have is what they like and what they want. So there's a strong emphasis in these discussions on preserving the character of the neighborhood, whatever that means. And that may come out of a confusing zoning standard, but it changes what they want. There's an overwhelming preference for residential, an emphasis on residential development. And as we look at this map, we may want to ask ourselves, aren't there several commercial zones and business zones, retail zones, where the need is to tighten up the zoning, not to open it up further. One thing that will help, I'm glad to hear that the Affordable Housing Task Force is moving ahead, because that's one thing that's been missing from the discussion so far, and we look forward to some guidance as to the extent to which bonuses will be permitted for the provision of affordable housing, because that's desired in the neighborhood too. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Alexander Street in Princeton. I wish I could summarize wisely and efficiently the points that I want to make. I also attended the John Witherspoon neighborhood meeting and took notes on it. And I just want to repeat Yaina's suggestion of a maximum lot size for the John Witherspoon neighborhood. That wouldn't refer to any properties that have already been bought and consolidated, but any properties that changed hands could be prevented from being consolidated. And similarly, there was a strong feeling at that meeting, as former Mayor Reed just suggested, that residential should be preferred to commercial development, although commercial development should be service businesses rather than formula stores or destination stores, businesses that serve the neighborhood in particular. And I will speak to what's called a town serving zone in Palm Beach. What Palm Beach did in 1991 was they converted their main commercial district into a town serving zone, which caps its stores at 2,000 square feet. This is any new store, any store that changes hands, and it impels them to serve primarily townspersons, those living or working in Palm Beach. Businesses larger than 2,000 square feet can apply for a special exception use permit, provided they have an auditing firm document that more than 50% of their receipts come from a local zip code. In other words, the onus is on the business owner, the property owner, to show that a larger business is indeed still town serving. From the statement of purpose that Palm Beach authored, it is the intent of this district to create, preserve, and enhance areas of attractive small-scale retail, personal and professional business services to be developed either as a unit or in individual parcels, providing for the frequently recurring needs of townspersons. To enhance the general character of the district and its compatibility with its residential surroundings, signs are limited to those accessory to businesses conducted on the premises, and businesses that advertise their services to out-of-towners are discouraged. This ordinance was challenged in court in 1991 by someone who had a restaurant in a 6,000 square foot building and wanted to enter into an agreement to lease it to the limited instead of to use it as a residence, instead of using it as a restaurant, the limited being the quintessential example of a formula business. His application was denied. And that's even though he brought evidence that his business would serve primarily local residents and people who worked in the town, his application was denied and the decision was upheld in court. one of the reasons for...
I don't mean to cut you off again, but you're over time, so if you...
I understand that. I'm finishing up here. One of the reasons for this ordinance is obviously to maintain the character of the downtown, to keep it a living place where community members meet regularly, but also, incidentally, it's to cut down on parking requirements, which are much heavier, obviously, for destination businesses than they would be for local serving businesses. And I'll send a copy of my notes from the John Witherspoon neighborhood meeting to the Secretary at an early but future date.
Thank you.
Many of my points have been made more thoroughly by people speaking before me, so we will skip down just a little bit. And these are simply notations on the most recent meeting of the Witherspoon-Jackson group last a Saturday or so ago, when Mayor Lempert herself said, "Don't zone to prohibit desired businesses." Someone proposed making a list of current retail operations, what is here now, what is desired, what is not desired, and, if my memory serves, what square footage should be permitted. Mayor Jim Floyd, former mayor, asked, who do we want next to us, and not only what? His son Mike Floyd said, avoid zoning that would allow greater density. Marvin Reed pointed out that Witherspoon is already more dense than zoning allows, and I said, if density is already greater than zoning allows, and people need really affordable housing units, possibly subsidized, then perhaps we should look at the Franklin Street lot that will be deeded by Princeton University to the Princeton municipality, an idea which Marvin Reed said was on the right track. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good evening. Is this on? Okay. Good evening. My name is Jim Kilgore, 492 Pretty Brook Road, Princeton, and I run the packet down the street. I just wanted to make a comment about FAR ratio. Many of the lots in the area, the buildings are, as many have said, exceed the current FAR. And I would recommend, when you're looking at that when somebody is able to find parking, that they should be allowed to build a building related to the FIR so that there's some flexibility and design ability within the community if they're able to provide the parking. We do want to promote small businesses in the town. Certainly we need housing, but businesses make a community much more vibrant. They bring taxes to the community. And I think we have a vibrant community on Witherspoon Street, and things are going fairly well. But maybe Lee can look at some FAR ratios and take some lots and do some rough designs and see what it would look like, and would those buildings fit in with the buildings that are there now already, some of them which don't conform to the current FAR. So that might be something to look at. But that would be my comment, and thank you for taking a look at Witherspoon Street.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to comment before we bring it back to council? Yeah, Kip.
Kip Cherry, 24 Dempsey. One of the concerns I have is that there are not many members of the neighborhood here tonight. When I went on the web to get the agenda, I didn't see it, and I think there was not good publicity within the neighborhood. So I think we really need to reach out and make sure the people who are really affected by this are involved. The other thing is that the neighborhood is going through evolution, and there are different components of the neighborhood. There's the African American community and their history, and there's the emerging Latino community and their emerging history, and then there's everyone else, of course. And I think we need to bring all of those parties into this discussion. So I really think we need to better reaching out. Also, I want to point out something that's already been referred to, and that's the character of the neighborhood, which I think is a very special place and also relates to its heritage. The idea of porches, off-street parking, relatively small windows, pitched roofs. This kind of character needs to be maintained, and we already have some houses that have been built recently that are very bulky and don't respond to those kinds of characteristics, and are really causing pressure in the neighborhood to lose its wonderful residential nature and its affinity to neighbors talking to neighbors, which maybe everyone doesn't use their porch, but there's this character of using your porch. And in fact, I noticed that many people do use their porches and do talk between porches. So I think it's very important to make sure that we don't make any changes that cause further changes in the neighborhood that are adverse to maintaining its character. I also want to mention that in my own neighborhood, I live in the Walnut Lane, Dempsey area. We have a house that came in for a variance. It was on a substandard lot, and the developer, cried about the fact that he couldn't build the house he wanted to build, and so a variance was provided, and the house that emerged was very bulky with very large windows that look into the neighbors, and it really is not within the character of the neighborhood. A lot of loss of trees, and I think that we need to avoid allowing that to happen.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to speak who hasn't had a chance? Okay, let's bring it back to council now. So we heard some, I think, good ideas. I think there's a lot to process here, but I would repeat the question that we started with, which after hearing the report from Mr. Sola and after hearing from community members, do we feel like we want to continue to look at this corridor, potentially start a process where we do a more formal visioning process with potential of, there were a lot of ideas that were thrown out there, maybe a form-based code, looking at some of the lot sizes, and do we want to change the zoning to reflect more what's on the ground? So, and if anybody has any strong feelings, Ms. Crumler?
Well, I still am having a hard time envisioning, like, Lee, can you kind of summarize what do you think about the zoning, the potential for building a lot bigger buildings? I mean, that's basically what it comes down to for me. Like, what's the potential for building huge out-of-scale buildings? Because I think that's what hurts the neighborhood.
I think there's some potential for that, whether it's by consolidating lots or just somebody tearing down what's there and trying to cram in as much as they can. So I think that there's a real threat there. There's also a real opportunity. This is an area of town where it's close to the downtown, it's close to schools. I mean, there's a school in the district. So it has a lot of advantages. As your planner would say, I'm more bothered by the fact that we have the RB and the B1 zone, which don't seem to work very well. I think we've also heard from the community a lot that there's a concern in terms of sort of what do we want the corridor to be. There seems to be a lot of, I don't know if it's been stated or unstated, concern that something's going to happen. When you look at the corridor, there hasn't been a lot of that. I think Avalon Bay may be a harbinger of what's going to, because when that the hospital is torn down and there's a new apartment complex there, none of us are certain what those impacts may be. But if you look at the corridor itself, there hasn't been a whole lot of new construction. There's been some rehabilitation of some. There have been, 10 years ago, a fairly large apartment building, and if you know the history, it could have been twice that size based on a previous approval from 20 years ago. So I haven't seen the pressure, and I think as Marvin said, while the zoning is complicated, it's worked. If you've been on the planning board, you know that there have been times where we've had to cajole developers to keep a porch. It would be nice to have a standard that says that's what we want, to keep a porch. I think the simple ground floor use analysis that we did point out a lot of conflicts. You heard preserve residential character, preserve businesses, preserve mixed use. Well, we could do all of those things or none of those things, And I think having some sort of visioning process or goal-setting process, we might, because there are still areas where it's more residential than mixed use. But we need to decide which way do we want to go, because quite frankly, the zone allows both, and that may be okay too. So I think there are a lot of opportunities here if we want to go that route. Or we could just simply say, you know what, it's been working and we'll wait and see. And that's really your call. You may recall when this first came up, we originally looked at doing some sort of consulting report. And it was very expensive to do both the visioning and the form-based code, but it may be time to do that. We may also want to consider whether you want to look at a historic study, and it would have to be more than the quarter. That's also, you need resources to do that, because we don't have any in-house staff to do that kind of study, and I think it falls to council to sort of start thinking about some of those priorities. But staff would need direction as to which way you want to go. If you want to venture into sort of a visioning that may lead to either zoning changes or form-based code and do it in a fairly quick manner, we're probably going to need outside resources and hiring somebody. You may want to appoint a small working group to put together an RFP and see what comes back, because it's easy to say we definitely need to have the visioning so that you know what kind of changes you want to make.
And I have a question. I know there's some interest also in looking at the area as a historic district, and would you recommend that those, if that were indeed to go forward, that a study for that would happen in parallel to what we were talking about here today? Does that make sense, or do you wait till one is done?
You can do it either way. You can run them parallel. You could do one and then the other. Some of it is a resource commitment and a time commitment. I think at a minimum we need to get out and have some sort of neighborhood meeting, probably with our Historic Preservation Committee and the neighborhood, and a larger neighborhood. This study has really just focused on the corridor, and you can see, just looking at Witherspoon Street, it's complex. Imagine if you broaden it, you're really looking at from 206 to Witherspoon or Jefferson or more, and for a historic study. So it's a large area involving a lot of time and a lot of resources. So I think some prioritization may be necessary, but maybe they run parallel for a while and we see where they're ending up.
And can you just outline again, sorry, and then Ms. Butler has a question, but so if we went ahead with an RFP, how do you see that process being? Part of it would be visioning, and then there would be
implementation, and that's either some sort of traditional zoning with design standards in the zoning so that they stick and have a little bit more force than they would if they were in the subdivision section, or looking at some sort of form-based code, or a hybrid of form-based code and traditional zoning, which a lot of communities have been doing. I believe Haddonfield's is really more of a hybrid, where with form-based code they're really talking about what does the building look like. With traditional zoning, as you heard me when I went through the different scenarios, we're talking about a 10-foot setback, a 25-foot front yard setback, a height, it's more of a box. With form-based code, you get a little bit more of a refinement in terms of what does the building actually look like, not setting the parameters for the box, but actually how it looks. Does it have a front porch? Does it have to step back as it gets taller? Does it have to provide breaks within the building? How much of it can be glass? How much has to be solids, and that kind of thing?
Ms. Butler, do you have a question?
What exactly is a visioning process, and how long would it take?
It varies. We've started, actually, what a visioning process would be.
Yeah.
Because typically what you do is you say, what's on the ground, what does the zoning permit, and then what do we want it to be? And we've started the first two parts of it. We've said, what's on the ground. I think with visioning we might go a little bit further into more of what uses are there, and maybe looking a little bit more at the streetscape. Then the zoning capacity, what does your zone say you can do? And then finally, what do you want? And you've heard a mixed bag, I think, from different people. Some wanting more business, some wanting to preserve more residential, some wanting mixed use. And it would be an opportunity for the community to say, this is what I would like to see, and whether it's along the entire corridor or just a part of it.
So a month or so ago, some of us had the pleasure of taking Shirley Satterfield's tour of the Witherspoon Street from Nassau down to, I guess, this building. And I was really struck because in our previous meeting, we'd heard someone, I think maybe it was Jim Floyd, talk about having a return to, making it strictly residential. But according to Shirley, the street, the corridor, and indeed the entire neighborhood really does have a history of having these businesses interspersed among the housing, because as Jaina pointed out, the residents of the neighborhood were not allowed to shop uptown. So for me personally, I kind of like the mix of the residential and the businesses because I think it captures both the history of it and also a neighborhood. It sort of reminds me in some ways of a neighborhood I grew up in and being able to walk to a corner store. And I guess to Ann Neumann's point, though, I wonder, I have no idea about this question of whether a 2,000-foot allowance is a viable square footage for a store, and based on some of the numbers of the properties you mentioned, some of them were smaller than that on the first floor. If we're looking at a first floor business, some of the lots are really quite a bit smaller. So we don't, I guess I'm fearful of unintended consequences. If we start to limit things, will it be so small that you can't get a viable business? And it's hard for me to imagine what the 280 units of Avalon Bay will mean in terms of demand for the neighborhood, but it would certainly, I think, be great to have some businesses in the neighborhood that did service, a bagel store, for instance, but can you do that in a 2,000 square foot? But some of these properties are much smaller than that.
I think you can.
If you really want to service people that live in the neighborhood, what does that mean in this day and age to have a viable business?
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer tonight, but I mean, we started to do that a little bit actually when we were talking about changes to the SB zone on Nassau Street, and we looked at some typical store sizes, and we could, do that again to say what makes sense. I think a lot of times people want to put the limit on because they're worried about, I don't know if in Princeton we'd really get a big box store, but something that would be fairly large. But most of the retail shops are fairly small scale, and I mean, we could do that kind of analysis if that's the way you want to go, or you allow a larger building, but then you put a restriction on in terms of the storefront, which is where we were headed at one point with the SB zone. So, but those are all design type standards or form-based code type thing that you could get at in terms of the building, and we could get you that answer. Tonight I couldn't tell you whether 2,000 square feet makes any more sense than 1,500 or 3,000.
Right. Well, the other thing I would bring up is that Princeton Future about 10 years ago now did a visioning statement for the corridor, a visioning process, and someone sent me, at least, and I had the opportunity to start to read it, and some of it echoed what we heard the first night that we had of our meetings, but one thing we didn't hear a lot about, that when I read their report of their first night, people talked a lot about the trees and how important that was, and so I hope we'll give some thought to the streetscape.
I think, Ms. Howard?
Are you trying to close up, or?
Well, I was going to say, I think it's really a process question at this point, and so, but yeah, go
I have
ahead.
a process question too, which is that we heard from some very articulate and thoughtful members of the community tonight, but not many thoughtful and articulate, not as many as we might have liked, and Kip pointed that out, and so I'm wondering, Lee, if the process you're proposing, getting an outside consultant, would that allow us to be able to spend some more time soliciting input, and would that, I'm not sure what happened tonight and why we haven't gotten more, but does that allow us to solicit more input?
I think at the last meeting we probably had more, if you're just doing a head count, more. We did the same noticing. Maybe we can do a better job because what we've been limited to is property owners, and maybe we want to just the properties, so we could double it up and send a notice to both the record owner as well as the property. but that's something that we can build into if we do an RFP to bring somebody in, or if we continue at a staff effort to do more of an outreach.
That's what it seems to me. Then
It's
you
also
can be
the
more
timing.
flexible.
I mean, this is the week for Thanksgiving, so there are people who are away, I think.
And there's a big
as well.
news announcement tonight, too. But I guess I think having a group get together and work on an RFP doesn't commit us completely, but this is, I know Lee sent out some feelers earlier just to get a sense of ballpark what something like this might cost, and we're probably talking, like $100,000 to bring in a consultant for the whole thing. So I think it's something we don't want to undertake lightly if we're going to come back and say, oh, the zoning works pretty well as it is. So that would just be my caution to council, is that if we embark upon this process, it's not cheap, and so we want to do it only if we're looking to, install something like form-based code or put something together that is not there now. I think if people feel like the zoning's sort of working well enough, then I would say we probably don't want to make this big expenditure. So that's really the decision point.
And I think that, from my point of view, it is working pretty well, but that's because we haven't had any huge developments besides Avalon Bay. Putting Avalon Bay aside. But I also was wondering if the historic preservation might, if there would be agreement that we'd want that neighborhood to be determined as a historic district, and would that be another way of getting what we want, which is preservation, if that's what we want? That's what I would want, preservation, but I don't know if there's broad agreement about that.
Well, and maybe that's what we do first, is we see if there's interest in pursuing that, given that I think we've heard that there's a time issue also about trying to do both in parallel, and a resource issue, that we can see first if there's interest in pursuing that avenue. And if there is, maybe let that play out. If there's not, maybe come back to the table again and see if we want to do something. I don't know, I'm just trying to get a sense of where people are.
That's what right, if I had to say right now what I would suggest.
I guess I'm reluctant to try and draw any firm conclusions on the basis of what I've heard so far. I think that there's a great need for much more dialogue, much more input. If I were to try and get any preliminary thoughts out of what I've heard, it's that the residents of the area like the way the street looks, and that the threat to the way the street looks comes from consolidation of lots that could lead to the building of much larger scale structures that might look different from what the street looks like at the present time. I'd like to hear more before I say let's go into a visioning study, or let's jump one way or the other. Let's oppose consolidation of lots. Let's go for form-based. I think that I need a little more input before I begin to draw some conclusions out of this.
Could I ask, what is it you want to hear? Bernie, what is it?
Well, I'd like, I've heard comments taken from the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood meeting. I've heard comments from people that attended that meeting. I see other residents of Witherspoon Street here tonight who haven't spoken, and if my preliminary conclusions that I've tried to draw are the right conclusions, I'd like to hear somebody say so. Generally, that we like the street the way it looks, but we're concerned about the aggregation or consolidation of lots that might lead to the building of structures that change the character of the street. So if that's it, then maybe that's the direction we ought to head in. I haven't been able to formulate that clearly in my mind, that is really what is being sought.
That's what I'm hearing. I haven't really heard anyone say we would like to change the zoning and invite new development that's different. We haven't heard anyone say that, have we? Have we? I'm really asking that as a genuine question.
No, I don't think we have heard that, but I think there are concerns that that may be already underway. I think, Mayor Reed talked about that
Right.
they're starting to see some pressures from the master plan, and
Right, I'm just trying to narrow down, for Bernie's sake,
it's also
what we have
it's also
heard.
aging housing stock, and so
Right.
Can it be preserved indefinitely? And
My recommendation, just because I know we have other things on the agenda tonight, is that we maybe call another meeting and maybe do a more informal meeting in the community room where we're not sitting up in the sky, and, invite the neighbors back and get a sense of, is there real interest in pursuing a historic district study, because, and to make sure people understand some of the pros and cons of doing that, and then talking about what this process might involve and getting some more feedback.
I think that's a really good idea. I support that.
Okay.
I'd also suggest that we invite some of the architects of the previous study done by Princeton Future to weigh in. It was 10 years ago, and it was before Avalon Bay had been, the hospital was bought by Avalon Bay, but nonetheless, there's probably valuable information there that we could draw upon.
Okay. All right. Well, given the opportunity, we've punted on this, but we'll have a community meeting at a time to be determined. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to schedule it before the end of the year. We'll try and see if we can find some time in December, but if not, we'll try to do it early in January. So thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight, who came for this, and hope you have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Guys, everybody.
So now John just said
And team, thank you.
Yes. And
thank
to
you.
Jack and Derek, too. Okay, next up tonight, we have a ordinance public hearing, an ordinance by Princeton deleting the residential senior community 1 overlay zone, RSC1 district in the municipality, removing the RSC1 designation from the Princeton Township zoning map and amending and supplementing the code of the Township of Princeton, New Jersey, 1968 in connection therewith. And I don't know if there's any questions up front from council on this, or if I should go ahead and
I actually
open the
do
public
have a
hearing.
question.
Yes.
Oh, gosh, now I've got to find it. There was a clause in the whereas, and bear with me here, that basically, I'm sorry I didn't see it last time. I should have, I'm going to get it. It's the ordinance, right? Yes, so the last whereas clause, or the next to the last, says, the mayor and council find that the housing needs of Princeton seniors are being met, and that other new developments, although not age-restricted, provide opportunities for senior living. Did we find that? Do we know that the housing needs of seniors are being met? And how is that done? Are there numbers about that? Or, I mean, it's certainly going to be an increasing demographic, one of which I'll be a part of, and so I'm concerned about my housing needs.
It's a good question, and that would be a finding that you would need to make. I'm going through in my earlier report when we had introduction of this. We pointed out that there are a number of developments, both affordable and market rate, and that was the genesis for that comment. In terms of senior housing, you have, as affordable housing for seniors, you have Spruce Circle, Reading Circle, Elm Court, Harriet Bryan House. Those are over almost 300 units of affordable. The newly constructed is Copperwood, which is 153 units of senior, and that has a set aside with 12 low and moderate income units. There is a RSM zone, which is the vacant land next to the shopping center. It's zoned but not built, which has a senior overlay with a 20% set aside, and that would get you 45 or 50 units. So that was the genesis for most of it. The other part of the comment really was dealing with other housing that's being built. Some of the 100 units at Palmer Square is appropriate for seniors. Probably not so much the townhouses, which is 3 levels, but the flats definitely are. They're elevator buildings to some extent. So those would be the borough's own redevelopment project, providing housing in the downtown, apartment-style housing. When the master plan was developed and we talked about the needs for seniors, it was a continuing care level and a variety of housing needs. And it was often pointed out that many of the townhouse developments serve almost as a de facto senior housing project, because that's who was moving in. In most towns, the townhouse development are young families using it as a starter home. We found anecdotally that many of the developments here in town, Campbell Woods, Governor Lane, are not young families looking to move into the community and then buy a house. Rather, they were people downsizing who already lived in the community, looking for that smaller, but still very active people. They were driving, and the like. So we have those kind of units. There was also some thought that Avalon Bay with 280 apartment units, while none of those are age restricted, again, are appropriate for a senior or an aging population in terms of not having the yard to take care of, an elevator building, covered parking. So that was the genesis for that finding. If council finds that's not, I'm sure we can take that out.
I was just curious whether there had been the demographics or some sort of estimate of what the population might be, but frankly, I do think there's kind of I think it's hard to downsize in this community. I don't think there are a lot of options. I mean, you named a few, but I think as people are ready to...
I think it's a concern, and we need to look at that a little harder. Tonight's study is a perfect example of a place maybe where you could provide that.
Right.
Are there any other questions or comments before we open up the public hearing? Yeah, Ms. Cornwall?
Well, kind of in regard to Joe's comments, I wasn't on the governing body when this was zoned before, but I prefer zoning that allows seniors but encourages a mixed age. I'd like to get away from senior housing, and I'm very strongly supportive of this ordinance because of that. I think the less senior housing, I just don't like. I think senior housing that's dedicated to seniors is often just a disguised way of keeping kids out, especially when it's 55 and up. That's just, 55 is not a senior. That's how old I am. And I can still go up and down the stairs. So that's one reason I'm glad to be doing this.
Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, I'd like to... Mr. Simon?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I do have a question, which is, Mayor and Council received a protest from some of the property owners in the zone. Mr. Solo, have you had a chance to look at that at all? Do you have any comment on that protest?
Just briefly, I can confirm an application for development or for an amended site plan was submitted. I think it was on Thursday. When I originally wrote my memo and you reviewed it and we discussed it, I think we reported back that we felt the project had been abandoned and that there had been no effort to continue it. And we gave you a little bit of the history. But we do have an application. As the municipal attorney has advised you, in terms of your action tonight, you can still take it. I'll defer to Lisa, but you need a supermajority vote if you take that action, or if you take any action. The existing zoning, because they filed an application, remains in place, and that will govern what the planning board does. So the planning board will be reviewing it under the old zoning. Because of it used to be called time of decision rule, where whatever the zoning was in place at the time of your decision, that's what governed. That got changed a few years back, and it's now a time of submission rule, and they have filed a real application. It's not just a couple of pieces of paper. So your action won't affect this amended application, would be my call. At least I don't know whether you want to comment legally.
I'm sorry, just before you comment, though, I do have one question. Is that these property owners are the ones who have filed the application, or are these property owners who are not party to that application?
My understanding is they are the applicant and they're part of the application.
Okay.
That's my understanding as well, that it's Princeton Land Development that has filed the protest. And I'll just say procedurally, there is a statute that under the MLUL, NJSA 40:55D 63, the council can still amend the ordinance, but because of the protest, there's a requirement that 2/3 majority of the full council has to actually approve the amendment. So that means 4 of the 6 members have to vote in favor of the ordinance for it to pass. And in terms of what Mr. Solo said, the time of application rule is in effect under the MLUL. So the application has been filed, and the zoning that is or was in place at the time of application will govern review of that application, not this new ordinance, if it is passed.
Do we still need 5 or 4 with Lance absent?
Yes, it's 4 because it includes him in the what constitutes the supermajority. It has to be the 4 of the 6 members.
Not just who's present.
Right, it's the actual full membership, so you have to count the 6.
Okay. I'd like to open up the public hearing, if everyone's all right with that. Would anybody like to speak? Come on up. Please make sure that you state your name and either address or affiliation.
Certainly. I can do this. Maybe not. But
Pull it out and hold it too.
all right. Sometimes I'm not sure about that. Thank you, Mayor and council persons. My name is Mike Pissarro. I'm the new policy director for the Stony Brook Millstone Watershed Association. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity and for posting this resolution. We are in favor of removing this overlay, and I'm still not doing well. Back in 2007, we suggested the overlay was not appropriate for the Princeton Ridge area. And so we're glad to see you moving forward to removing that. The Princeton Ridge area has wetlands, threatened and endangered species, and a geology that really is not conducive to high-density development. The Princeton Community's master plans over the many years has recognized the valuable resources the Princeton Ridge and the environmentally sensitive areas that Princeton Ridge is, and that this ordinance will now recognize and move forward with. I would also like to point out that even though this overlay existed, this area was never part of the senior housing plan for your master plan. And lastly, several years ago, the state passed a law that allowed age-restricted communities to remove that restriction because there was such a glut of senior housing. And I know last year I was involved in a case when I was a private practice attorney where the statistics showed that there was not only such a glut that it would be almost impossible for the communities to actually fulfill all the senior housing that had been approved. So I think this is quite an appropriate time as you're moving forward to remove this overlay, and we urge you to vote in favor of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wendy Mager, 459 Cherry Hill Road. I'd also like to speak in favor of the proposed ordinance. I echo many of the sentiments that Mike Pizzoro just expressed. But speaking as an individual, I'd also like to agree with Ms. Crummiller that I really do not feel that communities segregated by age or development segregated by age are a good way to go. And I actually am a senior. I'm older than she is. I'm also the president of Friends of Princeton Open Space and an officer of the New Jersey Conservation Foundation. Both of those conservation groups, one of them local and one of them a statewide land trust, regard the Princeton Ridge as a high priority area for land conservation because of the important role it plays in providing environmental services such as protecting our water and our air and providing habitat for the animals and birds we enjoy seeing. So I think it was always kind of an unfortunate dichotomy that at the same time the master plan indicated that this was an area that we wanted to protect, and we had actually quite restrictive 3 and 4 acre zoning on parts of the ridge. This part, which contains large swaths of undisturbed forest and large boulder fields, somehow got designated for higher density. So I think it would be a sensible move, and I hope that you will vote, all of you, tonight to remove this overlay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. Chuck DeSanto. I live on Mount Lucas Road. I wasn't actually planning to speak tonight, but I was curious about what was going on, and I've been a long-time opponent of this type of overlay for reasons similar to what Ms. Cromwell spoke about, but not only are there obvious environmental concerns, but from the beginning, which goes back now for I think 2001, when this particular property was first put forth, it was an obvious cobbling together of some lots of low value that were automatically increased in value by the notion of putting senior housing, which was a pretty hot topic at the time, in order to avoid the appearance of spot zoning on that property, which had all the earmarks of such a thing. 2 other sites were identified in the same basic area, the Princeton Ridge, for senior housing overlays. And I stood here in many, many meetings arguing against those. But in one particular meeting, it was decided and confirmed and agreed that once any housing project was successful as a result of these overlays, that the other 2 would be removed, because the whole idea of having these overlays was to try to promote this kind of development. It was not to make all of those areas happen in the same, basically, neighborhood. I don't know about the marketing studies. I'm sure Bob Hillier could talk to you about that, but Copperwood is what it is, and it's supposedly designed to serve that need. This other overlay, I think the other one was removed some time ago, I feel very strongly should also be removed to correct what was really a zoning, I think, mistake from that time. So I support the removal of the overlay. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to speak?
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. Mark Solomon, attorney with the law firm Pepper Hamilton. I represent tonight the owners of all but one of the properties, all but about 4 acres of the properties that are subject of this proposed ordinance this evening. And I'm here to ask that you not act on it this evening for the reasons I will explain. The property consists, the total zone, overlay zone consists of about 27.73 acres, and my clients control all but about 4.5 of that. So we did file the protest, and in fact, an application has been filed, an amended application has been filed for 36 units pursuant to the zoning and pursuant to the prior approvals. The history of this is germane for repeating, and we were not aware of the introduction of this ordinance, so we weren't aware that there's even a report that Mr. Solo did, so I don't have the benefit of that. But we did subsequently learn of this initiative. But if you go back to 2000, that time period, this room was filled actually with senior housing advocates, many, if not most of whom, have moved away or passed away. A whole generation was lost of people who were looking for senior housing options in this community, and they're gone, including my parents. And I'll come to this later, but it's an important point. What happened was ordinances were adopted, yes, for 3 sites. One was owned by Mr. Bryce Thompson, which was to the north of then Princeton Township. There was the site that was originally became the K. Havanini, the low tract, which is now Copperwood, and then this site, which was put together. Indeed, Mike Sanders, who is here with me this evening and was originally involved, at the time worked with Mr. Solo to help identify options for locations for senior housing. An ordinance was introduced, it was zoned in December 2001, and litigation immediately ensued challenging the zoning. And the defendants in that were the Township Committee, the Planning Board, and my client, who was named Intel Management and Investment at the time. Intel changed its name to Princeton Senior Development because the company Intel asked them to use a name that might not be confusing. The principal of that company remains the principal of the current owner today, Princeton Land Development. So it's the same people. And the other properties are owned by a trust, the Casey Souchure Field Trust, and that's the same people as well. That litigation, in what was an unusually collaborative process, resulted in a settlement agreement, which had as its basis a concept plan for development, and that provided, I think, for not more than 60 units on that site. And that process followed through, so that settlement was reached in October 28, 2003. Now, about a year later, maybe short of that, September of 2004, a preliminary and final site plan application was filed with the board. And that application did not reach the board until, I think it was 2007, because it was deemed incomplete and there were negotiations over trying to resolve all the details of it. But finally, in 2007, May of 2007, that application received a site plan approval. Those adjustments reduced the count, again, I think, to 48 units. It was memorialized in October of 2007, and then probably by the summer of 2008, the markets were already getting nervous in early 2008, and then the crash, the bottom fell out in October of that year. In 2011, we actually appeared, I personally appeared to say that this was not abandoned, that it remains viable, and that they continue to be interested in pursuing it, but there has to be a recovery, and they're working on it. So I'm here to tell you that the ordinance speaks to it being abandoned and not viable, and we respectfully would submit to you that that's not true. It is not abandoned, and it remains viable. It speaks of what was raised by Councilperson Butler, what's the demographic? Well, what I was aware of was that Harriet Bryan House was constructed, and I was the attorney for that, and that Copperwood was constructed, and I'm proud to say I was the attorney for that as well. But, and you can have a difference as to whether senior housing by itself is appropriate or not, but in 2000 and 2001, what was recognized by the committee was that there are competing interests with respect to land and serving seniors. And the balance has to be struck, and the time to do that was then, because we're not making any more land, and people are getting older, and the concept is potent, which is, is the town going to take care of its seniors? So, Copperwood is gorgeous, it's beautiful, but it is not the only answer to senior development. And I don't think it answers the question. Larry Field, who was one of the owners, he asked me to read his statement. There's a reference in here to over 80% of the property being preserved. He's referring to his lots on the plan that was the subject of approval in the amended plan, which has those one lot fell out and the unit count comes down. He says that over 80% of the property is preserved forever. I will say to you that it's about 80%, and it is a tightly clustered project, so that as much of the outlying areas, much of the property itself can be preserved, and there was a lot of negotiation over doing that. My name is Larry Field, trustee of the K.C. Sushores Field Trust. I know that Princeton is a special place, and that maintaining its character while meeting the changing world is a key part of your role as council members. The proposed development on Mount Lucas Road is respectful of the balance struck in Princeton between providing new housing and preserving open space. There is still a need for housing suitable for downsizing empty nesters who want to live within walking distance of Princeton's amenities. The proposed cluster development will help meet that need. At the same time, over 80% of the property is preserved forever. Large lot, single-family zoning does not strike a comparable balance. I respectfully ask that the council not delete the overlay district created to add new age-restricted housing. My clients spent over $1 million doing this. It pains me personally to see a decade of effort at providing for housing swept away with a pen stroke. And it pains me that there was already a generation of people who left this town and are no longer here to speak. And I respectfully request, for the reasons, for the unusual history here, for these important circumstances, that you not act on this tonight. I don't think it's been adequately studied, and candidly, with the application having been filed, the only purpose to do this would be to somehow try to prevent that application from going forward. We're not here to be adversarial. We're really here to say we're still here. This project is not abandoned. It is viable. It is going to go forward, and we hope you won't do this action tonight. Thank you.
Oh, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What is the application? I haven't seen it. Is it for assisted living?
No, it's age-restricted housing pursuant to the zone, 62 and over.
I know a lot of people moved out of town. I know exactly what you're talking about, and most of them, at least the people that I know, went to Windrose or Stonebridge, and not to, downsizing to an apartment. It seems like if I had to say what would be more needed in this town would be more assisted living facilities. Downsizing, most of the people who moved out when they were like 80 and up. Like, I would say that's what we need, senior housing for 80 and up. Because people are staying in their houses until they're, a lot older than...
Well, I guess what I would tell you, both from working in this area now, in this town probably for 15 to 20 years, because my firm has probably been involved with virtually every discussion of senior housing, of assisted living, and of nursing, and of CCRCs, because there were various discussions about CCRCs. There was one proposed for Tusculum that never got off the ground. There was one at what is now Princeton Academy that failed because of litigation. So in the end of the day, what Princeton did was it did it by, rather than putting them together under one roof, it did it by finding places for each of those. So there is a skilled nursing facility on Bunn Drive, who I represented. There's an assisted living facility on Mount Lucas, who I represented. And then there was these options. And as part of the settlement agreement, I do have to disagree with Mr. DeSanto. As part of the settlement agreement, one of the three options was removed. That was the Thompson land property. So the town made the conscious decision to preserve two, one of which became Copperwood and one of which was this site. And indeed, this site, well, there's a lot of history here. The Copperwood site, the low property, was actually proceeding faster, but then for various reasons, this property actually was the first to get approvals. Then K. Hov got approvals as well. And then the town said, okay, we've done this, this is consistent with the settlement agreement, and it's consistent with all the work that was done at the state to preserve this option. And those were the sites chosen. So in answer to your question, what you might prefer, I will tell you that 80 for age 80 for independent living, it's kind of late. That's not the time you move. But that's an individual decision.
Right, but I mean, I think we have, like we were just saying, we have Avalon Bay that we just built that is coming, and that's suitable. We have we solo mentioned all the places that I think are suitable for empty nesters. So
I have a question either for Ms. Krummeler or Mr. Miller as members of the planning board, or maybe Mr. Solo, but I know this came before the planning board, and if you could just talk about what the master plan says. My understanding was that this area was in the open space element, and can you explain about, the planning board, I believe, looked at this ordinance and gave it its stamp of approval, or?
Right, we did. Do you want to talk about the master plan? I'm not a big expert on that.
The planning board did review the ordinance, and they do recommend its adoption. I had prepared a report for the planning board. We looked at two of the elements, I think it was just two, in the master plan, the land use element and the open space element. And as indicated earlier and in your findings for the whereases, this site is not specifically mentioned as one of the senior sites. There are a couple of sites that are mentioned. It's also not mentioned in your affordable housing plan, and those are two significant parts of the land use plan. So it wasn't in that. We also found that, in general, it helps to maintain a balanced community. It preserves the character of the community. We've heard a little bit about that tonight already. It's protecting and preserving a natural environment. And protecting the character of established neighborhoods, and I think some of the folks who spoke earlier commented on that. In terms of the open space element, what happened was in 2011, we amended the open space element, and I'll read what we actually said in that is, and that the planning board amended the open space element of the Princeton Community Master Plan to identify a large portion of the RSC1 zone for preservation. The master plan then noted approximately 25 acres in the zone are in multiple ownership and consists of woodlands and extensive wetlands. The master plan went on to note that the site was the subject of various approvals, but should be considered for acquisition or preservation if the site is no longer viable or the approval for senior housing is abandoned. So in terms of public policy, if the application were to be abandoned, the master plan or the planning board was recommending its acquisition. What you're hearing tonight is that it hasn't been abandoned. We pointed out in the report there were two things. One, there's been a long time period with nothing happening on the application. I think as Mr. Solomon said, it was approved in 2007 and then kind of hung around without any action going on about perfecting that approval. In 2011, they did apply to convert it from senior housing to market rate housing because the law allowed that at that time. The board reviewed the material, deemed it incomplete, and then we had not heard anything from the applicant regarding that application. I did have some brief discussions with Mr. Sanders, who represents, I guess, the applicant, that they were still around, but nothing had been submitted at that point. So I don't think anything that the planning board recommended has changed other than the fact that I think it's clear the project hasn't been abandoned. It came back to life. They have submitted it, so in terms of your action tonight, it will not impact this development. They come in under the, I always want to say time of decision, but it's the time of application, and it will be reviewed and proceed along that way. But in terms of the community master plan, I think nothing changes in terms of it's not a senior site identified specifically in the master plan. We spent a lot of time talking about originally during the introduction that, and that's why those findings are in there to talk about, you know, what are our needs for senior housing. And I think that's evolved over time. I think Jenny probably indicated that when we were a borough and township, I think in 2000 the township policy was to provide age-restricted housing. The borough's policy was not to, and I was at those meetings. There was a definite divide where the borough council felt that we should be providing housing for all, and it should be not only appropriate for empty nesters or seniors, but the disabled as well. And their focus was on providing the appropriate housing for all of those. The township took a different tack and identified sites specifically for that, but not necessarily through the master plan, but through their policy that said we want to provide for senior housing. I think as the list of projects that we went over briefly tonight and in a little bit more detail, last month when this was introduced, there are a lot of sites that are both age-restricted and what's coming online. We didn't even talk about the Merriwick Stanworth, which I know is university housing, but they have geared it for faculty that are more empty nesters. I mean, and it's that type of housing. It's apartments, it's townhouse style, so it's not like their Gray Farm where you would have families moving into single-family homes. So I don't see this as a major policy shift at the planning board level to do that. I think we've maybe, and I agree with what Mr. Solomon said, it was a continuum of care that we were looking at. We were not able to find a suitable CCRC location, and there was a lot of effort put into that. So we do have, and the report pointed that out, we have a nursing home, 100 beds. We have 100-bed assisted living in town, which we didn't have before we made these zoning changes. We've put in place a couple of zonings for age-restricted housing in terms of affordable with Harriet Bryan House, and then the two sites that were mentioned, the RSC1 and the RSC2. Copperwood is under construction and being occupied, and this is that remaining site. That was a long answer. I hope I covered everything.
Okay, I want to return to the public hearing just so that we can wrap that up. So I don't know.
The only thing I would add, if I might, Mayor, is that between 2007 and 2008, what the applicant did was not nothing. The applicant had a number of conditions that had to be worked out, and they were going through the resolution compliance period following that approval, which is a lengthy, detailed, heavy lift and then we had the crash. So,
Okay.
to the point of abandonment, we would suggest that's not happen. Thank you for the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask
go
Mr.
ahead.
Solomon a question. Did you want to say something too? I thought when you started your remarks, you said you were going to explain, and perhaps I missed it in there, why, given the fact that your client has already submitted their application, so you would be governed by the time of application, why does this matter so much to you?
Well, this applies essentially only to this property. So the only reason to remove it would be to not facilitate that application. And, we're trying to do this both ways, essentially. We are seeking the protection of the time of application rule, but we're also trying to be very forthright with council and the community that we think that given the circumstances and given that this applies solely to these properties, it's not appropriate to remove it. It's all one and the same.
Is there anybody else who, did you have a question, Mr. Simon?
I have a question, I think, for Mr. Solo. I'll ask the question and you can figure out who needs to answer it, which is, given that there is an application before the planning board, what is the impact of this ordinance?
Well, I think if the application is abandoned and nothing happens with this application in the future, then you won't see another application if this ordinance were to be adopted. So it only really protects the current application, the time of application rule, until this is adopted. And then once this is adopted, any future applications would be guided by the new ordinance.
Question. Lisa, what legally constitutes an abandonment of an application?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's really a legal term or, I don't know, Lee, if you have any comment, but I guess it really depends on the conditions of the resolution which initially imposed the conditions and the requirements for compliance. And I don't have that resolution from the planning board, so I'm not sure what types of requirements or conditions were imposed originally.
Yeah, I don't think that's the issue, because what we said in the finding is that it appears to have been abandoned. And we based that on that there hadn't been any movement. I mean, we hadn't been contacted, no revised plans hadn't been submitted, whether they were doing work, getting permits from outside agencies, I don't know. But I don't think that that's a term of art that we need to worry about here, because there was nothing in the resolution that says if you abandon it, you can't build it. Because what typically happens when the planning board or zoning board gives an approval for a site plan and it's preliminary and final, there's basically a 5-year period of protection. It's 3 years and then 2 one-year extensions after that. And what that period of protection, you may have heard us talk about that at the planning board, and for those of you who aren't, is it protects them just from a zone change. So what they're asking is once you change the zoning, if there's not a site plan out there, you could change the zoning. If they had a previous approval, they have some protections that are built in from that zone change. The time of decision rule, which is now the time of application, changed the game a little bit and said you have to go with what the zoning is at the time they submit an application, not by the time you make your decision. So what this in effect would do is this applicant, whether we consider it an amended application or a new application, and that determination hasn't been made, falls under the existing zoning. If somebody else were to come in and, let's say, you heard them say they had, I think, 27 acres before, and now they have 23. Well, if they came back and said, now we only have 10 acres and we want to build 20 units, we would probably say that's a new application, and therefore you no longer have any kind of protection from the application that you just filed. So that's really what they're looking for, I think, and Mr. Solomon may agree or disagree. But if you don't act, it allows somebody else to come in. Don't forget, there are still some other acres of the zone. I think 4 of them were bought by the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, so we're not worried about them. There's still another 4 acres in the zone that are not controlled by this applicant.
I don't think that's correct.
Okay, well, let me just say, I'm starting to get concerned about time, and so I don't know if there's anybody else who is planning to speak at the public hearing tonight who hasn't spoken yet. Okay. The other thing is we might want to carry over the public hearing, or do we want to do it tonight? Okay, all right, then come on up. The people can line up, and then we have an extensive closed session tonight, too, and we don't want to be here till 2 a.m., so I'm going to now impose the 3-minute limit. I'm sorry. So go for it.
Okay, Chair, I'm going to be very short. I thought that the designation of this overlay from the beginning was not a good idea. I think that the Princeton Ridge is extremely sensitive and we need to protect it. We're not protecting it just for Princeton, we're protecting it really for all of the species that are trying to survive on the ridge. This is a really sensitive and important area, and we now find ourselves taking on the entire federal government and trying to limit the construction of a pipeline through there. And I think the studies that have been done recently, biological studies, show how intensely sensitive the ridge is. And now we also are finding out that there's a major prehistoric site on the ridge and another major historic site that no one knew about before. So I think it was ill-conceived. I think there was a lot of pressure from a few seniors at the time, and I think it was just a mistake and not a way to solve that particular problem, and I think it's a very good idea to delete the overlay. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who'd like to speak? Okay, seeing no one, I'm going to close the public hearing.
I'll move the ordinance. Second, I'm sorry.
Okay, it's moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Mr. Miller. Madam, are there any other further questions or discussion? Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Ms. Howard?
Yes.
Ms. Crum-Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Ms. Butler?
Yes.
Mr. Simon?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Okay. We now come to resolutions, and I just wanted to get a quick show of hands for who's still left standing. Are you all here for the municipal resources special needs? All right. Is there anybody here for any other resolution on the agenda? Okay. Then if it's council's pleasure, we'll bump up number 3, resolution 14-343, which is the firehouse RFP. And if you guys want to come, are there any questions about this resolution for the firehouse RFP? Any questions?
Yeah, I did have one question about that, which is...
Can you just make sure you're talking right into your mic?
Yep. Give me just a second to find my notes. I'm sorry. The study is looking at the standards required for the town. One of the things that sort of struck me by the fact that it's simply not in the description of what might be studied is whether there'd be any sort of assessment of what's in the region that might mitigate a requirement that the town provide the resource. And so is there any sort of concept of shared services and best practices that extends beyond the municipal borders that's sort of being taken into account in the standards of the study that it's proposed? Let me kind of sort of back up and just tell you why I'm asking the question. I suppose it's an extension of the thought process behind consolidation, but it's also Senate President Sweeney was in Princeton after consolidation passed, and one of the things he noted is the oversupply in general of equipment in municipalities across the state because each town feels they have to have their own, and then it leads to very inefficient use of resources. So I'm asking whether or not we're sort of taking that into account when we approve this.
So with that, the study is really focused on just the spatial needs and apparatus needs for the town. And basically what you're talking about is a shared service that
it would have to start at the top at the state level, because what you're really talking about is a county response plan, like regionalizing emergency services.
Well, no, I'm not really proposing that we go all the way to shared services, but the apparatus needs of the town can be reflective of the apparatus availability in the county and a neighboring
right, so
town,
we have
right?
mutual aid plans but they go both ways. Like, for example, we're going to be in Perth Amboy tomorrow covering mutual aid for them, which is a whole county move up from Mercer to Middlesex, because I believe they have a funeral that they're attending. So it's going to, a lot of departments in Middlesex will be attending, so they kind of move in from Mercer County. So there is a whole mutual aid plan in place, but really when you look at the apparatus needs, you're looking at what your town needs and basically they'll look at some things like the overall insurance rating system, the ISO system, of what we actually need to cover our town for fires in the way of Class A pumpers, ladder trucks, special services, apparatus. So, you know, the history is if you look outside of town to call in another town to cover you, it just, you know, it becomes a burden on that town to respond in, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Well, I think your concern is whether we can actually do a shared agreement with the equipment itself. Because we are talking about apparatus, I have not seen that done anywhere. I'm not sure that actually worked. There are probably other opportunities in terms of other equipment we can use, but in terms of the apparatus that we're talking about, I don't see the opportunity for that type of shared service.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions about the RP? And if not, is there a motion?
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Miller and seconded by Ms. Krummeller. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the resolution passes unanimously. Thank you. And what's the timing on this? When should we expect to hear back?
So we'll probably kick it off either towards the latter part of December or right after the new year. So I've already met with the consultant, so we'll have him back again to plan our strategy for, you know, who are the key people involved for him to meet with and different people in the community to get this going.
Okay.
And then we'll probably get moving on it in January.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. And then we're skipping around here, but I see the Princeton Ridge Coalition here now. So with council's indulgence, we'll go to resolutions 14-353, which is the resolution to approve extended work hours during construction of the Transco Leddy Southeast Expansion Project. Are there any questions or comments about this resolution?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Butler. Is there a second?
Second.
And seconded by Ms. Krummeller. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the resolution passes unanimously. Thank you. And now we'll go back up to the first resolution, which is the special events policy for Sunday events. If you remember, Bob Brusheye, this was one of his swan song policies at the end. And I don't know if there's any further questions or comments on this one, or if there's a motion.
I have a question, which is I thought one of the follow-ups was, when it was discussed, was sort of a discussion with High Tops because it would impact the marathon.
Right, we had a meeting with them, so Mr. DeShield and myself and Chief Sutter.
And what was the outcome?
We had a discussion both with High Tops. We came to a conclusion, mutually agreed they understand what we're looking for in terms of the events. They will be coming to council, I believe in January, to request an approval for, in accordance with this policy.
And are there any Further questions or comments on this one, or is there a motion?
Second.
It's moved by Mr. Miller and seconded by Ms. Howard. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The resolution passes unanimously. Next is the resolution establishing passive open space advisory committee, and it looks like that was passed out tonight. I saw it here.
I was able to link to it, too. I wasn't.
You were? I wasn't able to.
But I'll move it, but I would like to also amend it.
Okay. Do you want to suggest your amendment before you move it?
Well, technically, we should move it in second and then offer the amendment. But what I would like to do is establish the Executive Director of Recreation as the chair of the committee. I just think it needs to be a staff person. We're talking about an allocation of resources and how work is going to get divvied up, who's going to do it, and I think that it behooves us to have someone on staff chair the committee.
Well, but aren't we creating a new position, open space manager? Wouldn't that be more?
Yeah, if we have a replacement for Greg O'Neill, that person would probably be the...
Is that person on the committee?
Well, I think they were initially, but then...
I don't see them on this
I think
list.
that they would either be...
The designee,
the
right?
designee of the INO director or the rec director, but we don't know how that position is exactly going to be yet. But
I agree with you that it should be a staff person.
we can put that it's chaired by one of the members of the staff, but leave it open as to who? I think given that this is going to be something that exists hopefully in perpetuity, that you don't want it to be so restrictive that we're out of compliance with it.
So that is the first two members, is that all? Right?
Right.
And it could also be directed by the council person, too. It'd be chaired by the council person.
Are we
potentially.
staff?
Fine. Does that satisfy you?
That's fine.
Okay, so we're going to amend it. I guess I'll second that amendment then.
Okay, let's just make sure we're clear what the amendment is. So it's chaired by, do we want to say chaired by either a staff person or the council member, or just chaired by the staff person?
Fine.
Well, I would say chaired by the Executive Director of Recreation or designee, the Director of Infrastructure and Operations or designee, or the council liaison.
Okay.
Right?
All right, everybody fine with that? Okay. And it's moved by Ms. Butler and seconded by Mr. Simon? Is that right?
Well, I seconded the amendment. Didn't somebody already second? I'll second the whole thing, though, I guess.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. And all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the resolution passes unanimously. We've done number 3. Number 4 is Resolution 14-344, the Princeton 10-Acre Foundation Pledge Agreement. Is there a motion?
I'll move it.
It's moved by Ms. Krummeller. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Miller. Any questions or discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the resolution passes unanimously. Next is 14-345, Resolution 2014-R of the Mayor and Council of the Municipality of Princeton regarding Mercer Road, Mercer Street, and Princeton Pike. And this is an effort to redesignate these roads as municipal roads, as they already are functioning, and take off the county road designation, which shouldn't even be there, and hopefully reduce the amount of truck traffic. So is there a motion for this one? Oh, yeah.
I have a question about that. Does that not also reduce the county assistance in terms of maintaining and clearing the roads, snow removal?
No, not at all, because those roads have always functioned as local municipal roads, but for whatever reason, they carry the county designation as arterial road on the DOT street maps. So as a result, truck drivers and the routing services, we feel, are routing these trucks on Mercer Road, and that's one of the problems. The police department has such a problem with them coming over the bridge and doing damage and so forth. So since they've always functioned as local roads, we've been paying for the snow plowing, the maintenance. We just resurfaced the road this spring. We think it's best to get that county designation off of those DOT street maps.
And is it up to us, I mean, if we pass this resolution, does it do this, or are we just requesting that the county?
We are requesting the county to request the state to take that designation off, and we've spoken with the county engineer, and the county engineer agrees wholeheartedly.
Okay, great. Somebody move it?
Do you need a motion? I'll move it.
Second.
It's moved by Ms. Howard and seconded by Ms. Butler. All in favor?
Aye.
Resolution passes unanimously. And the next is Resolution 14-346, 2014 R of the Mayor and Council of the Municipality of Princeton requesting establishment of a 40-mile-per-hour speed limit and a 25-mile-per-hour school speed zone on a portion of County Route 604, which is Rosedale Road. And this is to reduce the speed on sections of Rosedale.
Jenny, did you discuss this at Traffic and Transportation?
Or Mr. Kaiser?
I don't remember.
Yes, it's recommended by Traffic and
A long time
Transportation.
ago, I feel like. And does this speed limit meet Sergeant Murray's 80% rule, or, I mean, aren't people going much, are we applying the same standard to this that we apply when we look at Terhune and we're refusing to decrease the speed limit there? Do we have a study that says that people are?
Where this came from the county engineering department. And when they redid the bridge, because of the geometry of the bridge, the geometry would not provide for a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit. So this is a housekeeping matter where they're putting the speed limit in proper category for the bridge that was constructed 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay. I'll move it.
Okay, it's moved by Ms. Butler.
Second.
And seconded by Mr. Miller. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the resolution passes unanimously. Next is 14-347, which is Crown Castle permission to complete nighttime work. This is for the installation of fiber optic cable, several streets.
I'll move it.
Second. It's moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Ms. Howard. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Resolution passes unanimously. Next is 14-348, resolution for a 60-day extension of time to award a construction contract for the Mount Lucas Road improvements, MA 2013 Mount Lucas Road Improvement Project 00623.
I have a question about this one.
Okay.
What are those improvements?
The improvements are the repair and the resurfacing of Mount Lucas Road from Cherry Hill Road up to Stewart Road East. In addition, in accordance with the Complete Streets policy, they'll also provide for bike paths on either side of the road as well.
And I'm sorry, does that mean we're removing parking?
The plan that we have currently prepared would not eliminate parking. Parking would continue, and there would be on the southbound lane there would be a bike lane along Mount Lucas Road from Ewing Street down to Cherry Hill, and the northbound area would be a bike path along the northbound side up to Ewing Street. And then as you go from Ewing up to Stewart Road East, it would provide for an 8-foot wide bike path on the western side of the road between those 2 points.
So I'm having a little trouble picturing this. Is the bike path essentially a wide sidewalk? Is that what we're doing, or do we have a separate bike path and sidewalk, or how is that working there?
On the section from Cherry Hill Road to Ewing Street, it would be a wide sidewalk that would be 6 foot wide, paved sidewalk on the eastern side of the road. And on the western side, there would be a bike lane actually right within the pavement of the road.
And the road can accommodate that and still accommodate parking, the existing parking on that road?
We have to do some widening of the road to make it work.
Okay.
I don't think this has been moved yet.
I'll move it.
Moved by Mr. Simon.
What's the extension for?
The extension, DOT had required as part of this grant commitment that we would have this contract awarded by, I believe, the third week in December. So we're asking for a 60-day extension to complete the design so we can get this project out to bid.
Okay, it's been moved by Mr. Simon. Is there a second? And seconded by Ms. Howard. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Resolution passes unanimously. I recommend we take 9 and 11 together. These are two PSAs for the Cherry Valley Road improvement project that we're doing in conjunction with Montgomery.
So moved.
They're moved by Ms. Butler and seconded by Mr. Miller. All in favor?
I'm sorry, I did have one question on that. There was a long list of exclusions. This is the one there was a long list of exclusions there. Was there anything there that we should be concerned about? In the PSA, under assumptions and exclusions, it was quite a detailed list.
Yes. No, we reviewed that. We are comfortable with what's provided in that PSA, and we've worked with this firm in the past on a number of projects. We've had a good working relationship.
Okay, thank you.
I think we already had a motion and a second. And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Oh, should I repeat who moved it and seconded it? Did you move it, Joe? I think Ms. Butler moved it, and I think Mr. Miller seconded it. And those were for the two, number 9 and 11. And now we'll go back to Resolution 14-350, which is a resolution in support of transportation funding. Are there any?
I'll move it.
It's moved by Ms. Howard.
I'll second it.
And seconded by Ms. Krummeller. Any questions or comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the resolution passes unanimously. Next is 14-352, bid award road materials to Trap Rock Industries LLC in the amount of $247,462.50.
I did have a question on this one. What was they were the only bidder. What was the expected budget that we had anticipated for this?
I don't have that information. This came from Public Works.
I'm not sure what the expected budget was. We can get that information for you, though.
Yeah, I'm just asking essentially whether this bid is exorbitant or not, right? Whether we expect, because they're the only bidder, right? So,
right.
Our only option is to either accept the bid or reject it.
One thing I can say, though, for these type of road materials, traditionally in the past, Trap Rock has had these contracts because they're located right here, and the nearest bidders are the quarries in Pennsylvania, much further distance.
Okay. So I think you're telling me that they are price competitive or have been in the past.
Yes, they have been.
Thank you.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Simon, seconded by Ms. Butler. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the resolution passes unanimously. Last is 14-354, the bid award, demolition of structures located at 472-480 Stockton Street. Wild Heart Bulk Landscaping Supplies LLC, not to exceed $68,000. Is there a question or comment on this one, or is there a motion?
Let me just add also, in reference to this bid award, and this is more of a follow-up to the memo that I had given the council. There was, subsequent to the memo, a letter submitted by Cobra Enterprises, the third bidder, memorializing its objection to an award to either the first or the second bidder. It doesn't change anything, and they didn't raise anything that is of any consequence, in my opinion. So I just wanted to add that and put that on the record.
Do you need a motion?
Yes.
So moved.
It's moved by Ms. Butler.
Second.
And seconded by Ms. Howard. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the resolution passes unanimously. And now we come to our consent agenda, which contains items of a routine nature, passed by a single vote. And are there any items anybody would like removed from the consent agenda? No? All right, we don't have to read all of these, so I'll just say the consent agenda, items 1 through 5.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Butler and seconded by Mr. Simon. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the consent agenda passes unanimously, and I would like to close the open portion of this meeting in the memory of Bill Scheide, who, as we all know, was just a tremendous person in our community who contributed so much, not only to Princeton, but to the entire nation. And I know there's going to be a memorial service for him this Saturday. And I think I speak on behalf of all council that we send our condolences to his family. And is there a motion to move into closed session?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Simon. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.